So how do we envision popular sovereignty and political awareness in history? The question of immediate mental images which occur when these mundane yet important terms are pushed down the historical timeline is intriguing. The common knowledge behind it even more so. After spending some time researching the prevalent paradigms in primary and secondary education, I believe I'm holding before me an image of democracy as a child of Athens, one brought up in Greece and unleashed to roam the cities of Europe for centuries, up until the Middle Ages, when it hid in its room like an angry teenager, waiting for the Enlightenment only to emerge once more, matured in the shape of popular revolutions. Considering the fact that we live in a time of vehement street unrests, powerful and fast-traveling messages of change, but also a systemic pushback against those distributing the messages, I would like to take the time and discuss what it meant to be political and dissident in Byzantium, a state that flourished during a period of most frequently understood as dark in European history and managed to generate an important arc of our cultural evolution. To set the stage for this, let us turn to a prominent religious warrior during the iconoclast era. In 819, vigorous Theodore of Studius found an effective way to dispatch his instructions to all the faithful followers he could reach from his place of exile in Anatolia. Unfortunately, the instructions also reached the emperor. Furious to learn of Theodore's activities, Leo V sent out for his arrest. The cleric confessed to writing the document upon being questioned and refused to follow the emperor's wishes. Imprisoned and tortured, Theodore described the experience in a letter to his brothers, along with the following message. The threat is more serious, the confinement stricter. But should we bow down and remain silent, obeying the human authority rather than God's? Certainly not. As Peter Hutley skillfully noted in his analysis of Theodore's letters, this abbot brought up martyrdom and dusted off freedom of speech, parousia, as crucial weapons in the fight against iconoclasts. I intentionally say dusted off parousia because the way the word is used in Athenian and Hellenistic writings for people who speak up in the polis, and the way it reappears during the Second Sophistic, and the way this concept surfaces in the 9th century letter collection, points out to its repetitive emergence and withdrawal in the literary tradition. The evidence of Theodore's somewhat unconventional employment of this word could be found in a letter of response to his fellow monk, who asked for a closer interpretation of a biblical passage which warns about the time of evil when, quote, the prudent person will stay quiet. To this, the abbot replied, were we not ordered to avoid giving dogs what is holy and throwing pearls to the pigs? When it was useless to speak, they established a principle by means of silence. End quote. With this analysis of the biblical entry, he has found a subtle way to interpret silence as an exception, but not as a rule. One is not required to speak up if the listener is not worthy of the words. However, over the years, as the fight got more radical, Theodore turned to different, less ambivalent verses. And one of the most quoted passages was the Hebrews 10:38. Quote, if they shrink back, my soul takes no pleasures in them. End quote. Examining the question of genre might help in further understanding these messages. There is little mystery in why this great religious revolutionary's letters were preserved in a collection and why they circulated widely. Prominent secular and religious figures often had their correspondences preserved. It is more puzzling, however, to consider why can we find multiple copies of letter collections written by semi-anonymous clerics and rather ordinary civil servants of 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries alongside this one. most Byzantine letter collections survive in only one manuscript. The fact that someone deemed a collection worthy to make and preserve another copy could be quite telling. In 15 collections of this period, 8th to 12th century, we find books of epistolary writings arranged in a very particular order without any replies from their addressees, often without exact names or dates, but with one striking similarity. Excluding 3 questionable collections, all authors, visibly and without any ambiguous interpretative reading, suffered from exile, imprisonment, or temporary removal from office. Considering the popularity of compilatory literature in mid-Byzantine period, the fact that at the time Patriarch Photius appears as the first one to define a proper name for novels, and that Suda, a proto-encyclopedic composition of the time, occasionally refers to letters as books, could it be fruitful to look at epistolary collections as a separate literary genre, one that carries a slightly different message from a letter itself? And if so, how does dissidence come into play? For almost 2 centuries, from Maximus the Confessor to Ignatius the Deacon, our textual heritage archives no letter collections in Byzantium. From 9th century onwards, epistles made a big comeback. Parallelly, while mid-Byzantine scholars copied, reserved, revised, and re-edited a great number of rhetorical handbooks, creating some of the oldest copies of ancient treatises on oratory we currently possess, like Menander's Rhetor or Aristotle's Rhetoric, the number and range of letters and letter collections grew. Photius, after all, composed an introduction to his famous library in a letter form. It is important, however, to mention that beyond their increased interest in literary handbooks that provide detailed instructions on every kind of writing, letters remain mostly unregulated. They are composed freely and according to some of the older available samples, as long as they meet the criteria of clarity, brevity, and charm. Therefore, when thinking of these 2 literary developments of the period, the need to dwell upon rules and rhetorical techniques for writing, as well as the increasing popularity of epistles, comments on style and quality of the surviving letter collections apparent in modern scholarship might seem surprising. 20th century editions and analysis of these letter writers characterize Aretha's style as too ornamented, turgid, and Ignatius as someone who has overemphasized the rhetorical adornment of his letters, and Hierosphactes as a sniveler, while Niketas Magistros is seen to give poor information, much like Leo of Synoda, Simon Magistros, and the anonymous professor. Yet his correspondence is full of allusions and to ancient mythology and literature, even more than it is of citations from the Old Testament. These comments are all the more surprising when they are considered with an eye to the basic expected attributes of letter writing in Byzantium, that is, clarity, brevity, and charm. It seems baffling to find that historical era, which devoted ample time to defining and preserving elaborate literary guidebooks, managed to see value in various texts that were overlooking those very instructions, so much so that it copied and preserved them in multiple manuscripts. The problems that emerge from this observation, that of letter collections as a genre and that of dissidence, are twofold. Firstly, defining and examining the purpose of letters and letter collections could prove fruitful. It is most likely that epistolary rules mentioned above were indeed officially were indeed used in the official daily correspondences in Byzantium. The letter collections, however, might in fact have been treated as a separate genre, constituting independent books, much as the pseudo suggests. The message of the letter, as a specific form, carries a more practical, clear, short address. It communicates immediacy and proves vital for the administrative life of the empire. The collection is, I would argue, not there simply to testify about one's activities or to serve posterity in matters of belles lettres. It would, in any case, do these tasks poorly, because it often omits those epistolary peculiarities that educate the reader about issues regarding immediate actions and context. Letter collections do tend to keep the epistles regarding important events of their authors' lives, yet these editions of letters sometimes offer long passages of elaborate ornamental allegories instead of precise, clear, and brief messages. With this change, it defies the rules of clarity and brevity. If, however, we decide to ignore the given instructions and entertain the idea of letters as vehicles for exquisite metaphorical excursus, one might find it difficult to understand how beauty or knowledge is conveyed through numerous blank letters that offer no information or innovation, but only refer to the messenger as the carrier of confidential content. Most collections preserve some of the so-called blank letters that the author would dispatch if the message was too confidential to keep in a written form. Previous research suggests that Theodore of Studio's letter collection counts numerous anonymous epistles, which refer to the oral message, simply because Theodore was in danger and had to wage his war carefully. He couldn't afford to compromise his brother's identity or reveal their subversive plans. Keeping in mind that Theodore's voluminous collection entered the Byzantine letter-writing canon and set the stage for future authors, the matter of hidden messages, which are regularly found in other collections as well, could cautiously hint in the direction of exile or dissidence in these texts. While editors of Mid-Byzantine collections did find fitting to redact personal information, dates, or places, while preparing letters for a collection, they did not decide on redacting these barren blank letters from their books. This brings us to the second problem, that of dissidence. To a certain degree, I struggled to find a proper term that would adequately encompass pharesia and all of its effects, whether they resulted in exile or not. The solution arose as I encountered Tim Whitmarsh's clever analysis of exilic literature in the early Roman Empire, one that reappeared due to Domitian's and Vespasian's banishment of philosophers. Exile became the hallmark of the free-speaking philosopher in the time of the Second Sophistic. The positive sociocultural value of philosophers' banishment can be read in Dio Chrysostom's words. Quote, "If I narrate the course of my exile, men will say not that I'm lamenting, but far rather that I'm boasting." End quote. In his work, Dio, like the two other authors closely examined in this analysis, continues to prove that physical isolation cannot stop him from thinking or speaking freely. The power of pharesia is particularly interesting to consider in this as well as in Mid-Byzantine letter collections. There are 4 names whose collections surpass all the other letter writers of this period: Theodore of Studios, Photius, Michael Pasillas, and Theophylacte of Ohrid. Their collections encompass hundreds of letters, and they are preserved in numerous copies. all of those men suffered exile at least once in their lives. For the 3 centurions included in my survey, there are 12 collections of authors who, to some extent, share Theodore's, Photios, Pasillas, and Theophylactus' destiny. More or less clearly, they all expressed their suffering in the epistolary books left behind. Without exception, they all, at some point, refer to the importance of parousia. There are many shared and overlapping traits in these letter collections. From sickness, isolation, suffering, contemplation, defense from attacks, verbal counterattacks. These similarities, when considered in the context of a separate genre, are read beyond this single letter, open up various fruitful avenues of exploration. The usage of free speech as a concept of Greco-Roman literary tradition creates a visible referential line that connects authors from Cicero to Musonius over to John Chrysostom, Theodore of Studios, Photios, and Pasillas. In his pleas, Theodore chooses the example of John Chrysostom, an author who mentions parousia about 500 times in his work, as an acceptable role model when it comes to speaking up. He brings up John's reproach of Empress Evdoxia, who divested a widow of her land, an action which left Chrysostom subsequently exiled. Ignatius the Deacon straightforwardly expresses that he is not allowed to speak freely in his letters 8 and 16. And interestingly, he underlines the importance of parousia while advocating for the return of Thion's bishopric properties through a metaphor of a widow deprived of her legal possessions. A careful reader of rhetorical handbooks used in the Mid-Byzantine period could find a clear purpose in these repetitive textual images. Nicholas Mysticus, a 10th century patriarch, turns back to the motif of parousia in a persuasive manner, just like Theodore did. He employs it to convince the Archbishop of Bulgaria to stand up to Simeon in letter number 4, reminding him that he should use, quote, the freedom of speech towards him who has the rule over you, when he is, as men may be, moved to anger against anyone, end quote. Sliding past the fact that the patriarch is quite conveniently pushing his addressee against the Bulgarian enemy, it is noteworthy that he is doing so by mobilizing free speech. Nicholas' collection ends with a letter to an unknown recipient. In that letter, we learn very little about the circumstances that inspired this correspondence, although it was suggested that it was most probably written during the schism. The whole letter is one vague appraisal of the addressee's resistance in time of trouble, since he is not afraid to speak freely every time, quote, the madman rages against him, end quote, in letter 190. I would like to emphasize the fact that this topic is found in the end of the collection. If we are to accept that letter collections could be read as books, the position starts to matter. Leo of Synod ends his epistolary opus in a similar theme. He cried due to pressures, troubles, and censorships unleashed on him, and he reminded his addressee about the freedom of speech with the following words. Now, one of the bishops was slighted in ecclesiastical vote, though he ought not to have been. Now it is going even further. I was still a child, for I remember that I saw the man who spoke in the opposition, how many that one man opposed, who he was, and before how large of audience he spoke, what his reasons were, and how he was not ignored. The whole letter goes on to explore the importance of speaking up. Most directly, it advises. And just as the former inhabitants of Asia unwillingly became enslaved to a single man because they were unable to produce a single syllable no, so you too will. In the very last letter, one that comes after the quoted example, Leo approaches defeated. He informs us of his sorrows and lengthy attempts to arrive to the capital or get any honorable posts. In the sea of examples stretching out throughout these 15 collections, I would like to conclude with the most famous sniveler of all time, Michael Pasillas. He refers to the inability to speak freely in his letters to Ioannis Xyphilinos, and especially to Michael Kyrolarios. The connection between Parissia and his exile, however, becomes most prominent when the correspondence is cross-referenced with the chronographia he wrote. It has been argued that Pasillas' historical text relies greatly on careful organization. Every chapter has a specific place and purpose. In such arrangement, the term parousia does not appear at all in any context until chapter 6 and the book of Monomachos, the emperor responsible for Pasillas' exile. Once the personal story of his political downfall is revealed, freedom of speech enters the scene. Finally, a word about the culture of reading in Byzantium. What message could have been conveyed with such collective form? What did medieval readers expect when they were looking at a book of letters? The editor of Ignatius the Deacon's epistles noted his surprise to find this author's name and correspondence among the entries of the Suda when Ignatius was, quote, not to be described as an intellectual figure of the first magnitude, end quote. Secondly, he remarked the unusual perfect participle form of Gegonos applying to his tenure as a metropolitan of Nicaea, as well as the fact that even though he was a bishop, he was described by an inferior rank of a deacon. The latter, perhaps, could be explained exactly by the loss of Ignatius' status. The former might be understood if we consider all the letter collections apparent in Suda. The majority of writers in this lexicon have actually experienced exile. Furthermore, whenever these letter collections are given a positive quality like excellent, striking, or remarkable, the authors were, with no exceptions, banished dissidence, which is 6 cases. The writer of Suda often does not even leave to the readers to conclude on their own, but he underlines it directly. Musonius, for example, was killed, of course, by Nero for his outspokenness. Severinus was prone to controversy and contentious to his superiors, and he was therefore a wise letter writer. Themistocles had to flee due to envy, so he died away from his home, but he left letters full of spirit. Theocritus, a political opponent of Theopompus, wrote remarkable letters. There was, or so it seems, a recognized interest in the letters of the exiled or politically controversial individuals, and in that context, Ignatius' collection understandably found its place in such tradition. We can but wonder how far the multiple collections of Photios, Mysticus, Mavropos, Syneda, or Theodore of Nicaea traveled. some of the copies of their collections were found in very distant urban and ecclesiastical centers, although it's difficult to recreate the itinerary of these books. It is conceivable that readers of medieval Roman world recognized the political battles concealed in these books and shared them as such, negotiating the power of free speech. Suda, if no one else, realized the potential dangers of sharp tongues. So, under the heading of paresia, it documented the violent death of Nicodemus of Aphidna, who, quote, with his both eyes knocked out and his tongue cut out, ended his life, unquote. Seen through this lens, I would like to end this short review with a question more than a conclusion. If the message of one letter is immediacy or proof, could the message of a collection for Mid-Byzantine readers be dissidence? Thank you for listening.